My name is Imad Harb. I am the Director of Research and Analysis at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Lebanon's current political quagmire and its severe economic and financial crises have created immense humanitarian consequences. In 2021, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights described Lebanon as a failing state. And the World Bank's Lebanon Economic Monitor has labeled the crisis as one of the most severe since the 19th century. The deep economic and financial crises that the country has been experiencing since 2019 have only been exacerbated by a political deadlock over electing a president, and have also been compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic and by spillover from the Syrian crisis and the influx of refugees. The disastrous Beirut port explosion in August of 2020 and the collapse of the economy have created severe humanitarian hardships for those residing in Lebanon, a quarter of whom are refugees, leaving unprecedented numbers of people in need of humanitarian assistance. Even though the country's multi-layered crises and political dysfunction have resulted in a dire humanitarian emergency, Lebanon's political elites are unlikely to address the roots of the problems and would instead likely work to further safeguard their political and financial interests and agendas. I'd like to just point to two important and poignant developments over the last just few days. 2 days ago, Lebanon commemorated the 18th anniversary of the March 14th demonstrations, 2005 demonstrations that basically laid the groundwork for what the Lebanese hoped would be a new Lebanese state with new institutions. Unfortunately, 18 years later, things, instead of getting better, have become really multiple layers of worse. 2 days ago, also, the Lebanese lira, the Lebanese national currency, crossed another, I don't know what to call it, but basically a landmark, a milestone of further collapse, reaching 100,000 to the US dollar. And for today it's north of that. It's probably about 106, 107,000 to the US dollar. And there is no end in sight. Doesn't seem to be an end in sight. The problem with this specific thing, the issue of the currency, is that everybody in Lebanon, or most of people in Lebanon, are paid in local currency, and almost 85 to 90% of Lebanon's commodities are imported from abroad. So the situation is really very, very, very dire. I also would like to remind everyone that also today or yesterday is a commemoration also of the 12th year of the Syrian civil war, which has really influenced Lebanon in many, many ways than can be discussed right now. Arab Center, Washington, D.C. has convened a panel of experts to discuss the humanitarian impact of Lebanon's multiple crises and to explore potential pathways forward. Panelists will discuss the roots of the country's political gridlock and financial collapse, explore their impact on the population in Lebanon, and provide recommendations for long-term sustainable development, accountability, and structural and governance reforms, as well as for the US and European foreign policies. Panelists will speak in the order in which I would introduce them. Each will have about 10 to 12 minutes to make his or her remarks. We will have a Q&A session after all the presentations have been made. You can ask your question using the Q&A feature on your Zoom page, or you can email us at events@arabcenterdc.org. That's events@arabcenterdc.org. We will start first with Nabil Khouri. Nabil Khouri is a former diplomat, and now he is a non-resident fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. And he will focus on the big picture, basically the background. What caused the humanitarian crisis, the political crisis and government vacuum? What are the external influences that are affecting political developments in Lebanon? Next will be Patricia Karam, who is a non-resident fellow with the Arab Center also. And she will look at the scale of the humanitarian emergency, financial collapse, access to basic needs, and impact on different populations like vulnerable communities and refugees. Then we will hear from Rola Al-Husseini. She is an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at Lund University in Sweden. And she will address the impact of sectarianism in general on the humanitarian situation in Lebanon and on different population groups, including women, and focus on the issue of what she calls sextarianism. Really lovely. Last but not least will be Zena Wakim, who is an international lawyer and president of the Board of Accountability Now. She will focus on the entrenched corruption, humanitarian impact of corruption, the lack of accountability, investigation into the Beirut port explosion of 2020, and pathways to accountability and government reform. With all that, Nabil, floor is yours.
Let me start with what's always in the news internationally these days. It was recently reported that the Ukrainians are in a race trying to fix their electric grid faster than the Russians can bomb it, and largely succeeding in doing so. Many of the cities of Ukraine are still lit up despite the brutal war that's going on. Contrast that with Lebanon, which 20 years after Israel's withdrawal in the year 2000 is still living in partial darkness. And by partial, I mean 2/3 of the electric grid is simply not functioning in most of the regions of Lebanon. At the same time, in the recent news, along with the Ukraine experience, President Biden, using the Presidential Drawdown Authority, just this past year alone, has taken $19.6 billion in military assets from the US military, giving them to Ukraine to help Ukraine in their current struggle. And billions more are programmed. Of course, at the same time, there are billions of dollars in equipment and money being given by other NATO members, by Europeans to Ukraine to help them with the vast challenges that they have. This points out to two things for me. The motivation to fix the problem is there domestically in Ukraine, and the domestic situation is matched by the international situation. There's a great deal of motivation on the part of much of the Western world to help Ukraine overcome its problem. These two things are missing in Lebanon. Domestically, we can say, yes, of course, most Lebanese desire the situation to change, but those who desire change don't have the power to make the change. And those that have the power don't have the desire to change. They're content with the way things are. There is no reason of a technical or monetary nature why electricity, which was bombed several times, admittedly, by Israel, going back to when they withdrew in 2000, bombing the electric grid and other infrastructure in Lebanon before they left Lebanon. Several wars led to several destructions. Nevertheless, the Lebanese have always possessed the technical know-how, and the money has always been there to fix the electric grid, yet it remains today unfixed. Clearly, those who are benefiting from the alternate economic avenues don't wish to go back to electricity as normal and government as normal in Lebanon. The other thing is that international factor. Given the amount of US aid to Ukraine, if you compare what was recently said by Samantha Power, that $72 million in emergency food assistance, and she went on to specify that 650,000 vulnerable people in Lebanon, and that includes refugees from Syria and other countries, are benefiting from this emergency food assistance. It is simply unbelievable that a lot of US officials keep referring to $3 billion that have been given to Lebanon. But the small print is that this was over the past decade. In 10 years, $3 billion have been doled out. Much of that aid has gone to the Lebanese armed forces. As much as the Lebanese armed forces deserve all assistance they can get, the idea is that the real developmental needs, the real humanitarian needs in Lebanon are going unfunded by the international community. Much of the aid that was promised by Europe, by the World Bank, by the IMF, are all very conditional. And they're conditional on things that Lebanon has proven incapable of providing. The types of reforms that are mentioned really never mention that what you need to do is to overturn the entire system. You cannot tinker with reforms along the edges of a system that has simply gone rotten to the core. Lebanon's financial and economic crisis has repeatedly been said to be one of the worst economic collapses since the 19th century. Lebanon now ranks along with the three poorest and most stricken countries in the world. Contrast that with what used to be known as the Paris of the Middle East, Beirut, in the 60s, the country that was the jewel of the Middle East has fallen quite significantly. I think now, of course, we have to take into account 15-year civil war, which ended, but the consequences of that war are still very much with us. Israelis first bombed the electric grid in Lebanon in 1978, then again in 82, and through 18 years of occupation, Israel devastated much of the Lebanese infrastructure. These bombings ended pretty much in terms of a basic attack on the infrastructure, although in 2006 there was another one, yet another one. During this time, though, there have been plenty of opportunities for both domestic and international efforts to fix what was destroyed. There, as I mentioned, the alternate economy on which many of the mafia leaders in Lebanon, those who pass as the elites who govern the country, they are surviving very well on the alternate economy. If the electricity example alone is given, then we look to the generators, the motors so-called, in Lebanon, and the mafia that runs those generators. And that mafia does not wish the official electric grid to take away their source of current livelihood and current power. The same applies to water. The same applies to sanitation. I wrote something in end of 1914, early 1915, called the garbage politics in Lebanon. Garbage is a big business. And the fact that until today, there is no proper recycling, there is no proper taking, collecting, and storing of garbage in Lebanon, is because there is a business which the various mafia leaders disagree and fight and compete on taking. Otherwise, there is no excuse. A state that cannot collect its own garbage is simply a failed state. And the Lebanese state has failed on all the basic services that any government is supposed to provide its citizens. If we find that the case is motivation, and that neither domestically nor internationally is there the motivation to fix Lebanon, theoretically the rulers of Lebanon, the mafia leaders, can get together and can agree either to split the spoils of Lebanon evenly amongst them, or to simply agree to stop taking the benefits that they take out of the alternate economy, and to agree on a national reconstruction plan that can be funded from the outside, provided none of them control any aspect of the reconstruction. And I say theoretically, because we all know that this is never going to happen. They are never going to agree to stop benefiting from Lebanon's failed economy. This is the one theoretical way out, which realistically doesn't exist. The other one is what in 2019 was called a thawra, the half of Lebanon, which demonstrated for change and said, kullun yani kullun, meaning everybody needs to go, all the ruling elite. This idea of thawra was clearly a failure, not because of the lack of desire on the part of a majority of Lebanese, but because simply they have no power to face the other half of Lebanon, which, you know, the mafia leaders and their followers who are willing to die in support of their zaims, in favor of their rulers, in favor of their chieftains, and would confront by force anybody who tries to bring about forcible change. Thawra without the use of violence simply doesn't work. I'll end with the big picture. Given the way things are today, given the lack of international interest to fix Lebanon and the lack of ability inside Lebanon to fix itself, there is no exit. I don't see a solution coming in the next 50 years. Sorry to end on this pessimistic note, but that's the way I see it. Thank you, Ahmad.
Thank you very much. Pessimistic or not pessimistic, unfortunately, the reality does not lend itself to more optimistic evaluation. A lot of work is needed. Patricia, your turn.
Thank you, Ahmad. I have the layout. I have the unfortunate task of laying out the picture of humanitarian catastrophe But I'll hopefully try to inject some positive notes. If you look at Lebanon today, just as an introduction, weekly grocery bills are really equivalent to months of someone's typical income. Banks are refusing to let people withdraw money. Basic medicines are often unavailable. And again, we still have gas lines that can last hours. As Nabil pointed out, many homes lack electricity. So yes, Imad, you laid it out. Lebanon is going through a humanitarian catastrophe that's caused by a financial meltdown that we can also discuss maybe in the Q&A. We've seen massive capital flight, foreign currency shortage, banking sector which is insolvent. And again, you've mentioned very briefly the ripple effects, the devaluation of the Lebanese pound, but also like inflation that has at times reached 280%, which means a loss of savings as hundreds and thousands of people were cut off from deposits, with job and salary cuts, with depreciated incomes. And these factors have really deprived large segments of the populations of their livelihood. And the things that certain factors, as we know, that have made things worse are the protests that racked the country in October 2019, the pandemic, which already hurt Lebanon's vulnerable economy, especially tourism-wise, and the port explosion, which itself was made possible by corruption and mismanagement. Now, if we talk about the economy is projected to contract after already declining by 10% and 20% in the past couple of years. Unemployment is growing, especially youth unemployment, which is at almost 50%, and really has forced some of the country's sort of brightest and youngest job seekers to leave the country. And we have almost 1/3 of the population out of work now. And compared to before COVID, it was about 11.5%. And for those who have work, the minimum monthly wage is about $25. So this situation, the humanitarian situation, really continues to worsen and triggering more poverty and despair. Nabil mentioned, the poverty rates. Because of the economic collapse, an UNICEF estimated about 77% of households do not have enough food or enough money to buy food. So food insecurity has really become so grave that, as you said, Nabil, I think you might have been referring to that, the World Food Program added Lebanon to a list of the world's 20 worst hunger hotspots in need of assistance. Let's talk a little bit about disparities. So there are areas of the country already suffering from years of marginalization that have been hit the hardest and by a catastrophe that has really exacerbated socioeconomic inequalities and regional disparities. For example, Tripoli, which is the largest city in northern Lebanon, has really been one of the poorest. And even before 2019, more than 50% were unemployed and 77% economically deprived. So same for the rural areas of Akkar and the Bekaa in the northeast, as well as some suburbs of Beirut, which have some of the poorest segments of the population. And, this is anecdotal, but you see everywhere adults and children asking for money in the street, homeless people, individuals looking in dumpsters to eat or to sell. Then there are the refugees. And as Imad mentioned, Lebanon has one of the highest numbers per capita, about 1.5 million Syrians and an estimated 300,000 Palestinians, and the majority who have been living in overcrowded and really poverty-stricken camps for decades. And because of the crisis, now they have limited access to food. According to the UN, 9 out of 10 Syrian refugees live in extreme poverty, and really 99% of Syrian households are struggling to put food on the table, and therefore are estimated to be living, about 90 are estimated to be living in extreme poverty. And this has, of course, led to them resorting to all sorts of negative coping strategies, including things like, child marriage, child labor, borrowing money, begging, etc. The health system. Again, the bankruptcy of the state has really weakened all over public services. We talked about the provision of electricity, but as a result, the healthcare is really threatened with widespread shortages of fuel and power. And again, the restrictions on dollars and the lack of dollars are really preventing hospitals from purchasing medical supplies, equipment, which are mostly imported. And this has really led to acute shortages, as well as shortages of medicine. And you see a shift in hospitals that cut down on elective surgeries and to save supplies for emergency procedures. And again, while healthcare has really impacted the majority of the situation, it has especially affected the most disadvantaged, who are not spending money for preventive measures and delaying care until critical conditions. And again, the numbers of doctors and nurses who have left the country are staggering, about 40% of the doctors and 30% of the nurses. And so again, this is especially impacting the Lebanese, not just the Lebanese, the Palestinian and Syrian refugees, but also the migrant populations who don't really have access to adequate health services. Now, then you have food insecurity as well, which has been disrupted by the Russo-Ukrainian war, the grain supplies, and really threatening food security. 57% of households cannot afford food. And again, like fuel shortages are really disrupting water supplies, and as a result, unused water pumps are leading to reliance on suspect water sources, which are contributing to things like the cholera outbreak in October of 2022 that really, again, demonstrate the impact of faltering sewage and water infrastructure. And of course, this is of course aggravated by a number of, or a combination, I would say, of poor environmental governance, which is causing water scarcity, wildfires, proliferation of wildfire, and widespread environmental degradation. Briefly, I mean, before starting to wind down, Imad, situation of migrant workers, one cannot not mention it, because there are about 135,000 in Lebanon who have also been severely affected by the conditions, especially unemployment, food and shelter insecurity, and access to essential services like drinking water and healthcare, mental health care. And many are unable to go back to their countries or meet their basic needs. It seems 60% of them are in need of humanitarian assistance. And they have to, again, due to the kafala system, choose between accepting exploitative work conditions or become irregular, which again limits their access to assistance and exposes them to things like human trafficking and sexual exploitation, detention, etc. Now, protection concerns predate the crisis, but these have really increased and been exacerbated. And again, finally, politics. The political uncertainty that Imad pointed to is high given the stasis that is prevailing. There is no functioning government, there is presidential vacuum, and political volatility has really increased tensions. And we see the proliferation of local clashes. And again, economic and state decay are really destabilizing the country's political balance, and the crisis, getting worse every day, is really threatening to turn into sectarian, to turn sectarian with clashes, which have been widely reported, shootings in front of gas stations, in supermarkets. So again, this rising poverty and despair has really changed cities which previously were generally safe. It has transformed them into ghost towns at night, as we see the increase of theft crimes by 144% since 2020. Again, just to close, foreign donors, have really conditioned, as Nabil said, the massive bailout that is needed to stabilize the economy on an agreement with the IMF that really would require, you called it, fiscal discipline and reform, really economic overhaul. And again, Lebanon's leaders have not cooperated. They have resisted resolution of the country's bankruptcy that would really disadvantage bank shareholders or top depositors. They have also yet to carry out basic measures that are required as preconditions of a bailout. And in the meantime, of course, private banks have allowed elites to move money out of the country while restricting ordinary depositors' access to these accounts, meaning again that the heaviest burden from economic losses has fallen on those least able to bear it. So this is the sad reality, and Nabil has pointed it out, that politics in Lebanon doesn't show any sign of improvement, and the downward spiral is really likely to continue. And unfortunately, mismanagement, corruption, and the lack of transparency have hindered aid delivery. However, there are certain things that can happen to relieve the humanitarian pressures, especially on the aid delivery front. But Imad, I will leave it to perhaps tackling it in the Q&A to allow for the other panelists to discuss their perspectives. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. Rola?
Yes, thank you very much for this invitation. So after my colleagues have provided a more macro vision of what's happening in Lebanon, I'm going to concentrate my intervention here on one group, one vulnerable group, namely women. So as you might know, women were on the front line of the so-called 2019 revolution because their rights were central to these protests. And the problems facing Lebanese women have only been exacerbated by the crises affecting the country in the past few years. And I think we can speak of three categories of women in Lebanon. We have Lebanese women, Lebanese nationals, migrant women who come as domestic workers that Patricia alluded to, and refugee women, namely Palestinian and Syrian women. And the issues that I'm going to discuss affect all these women, all Lebanese women, but not necessarily refugee or migrant women. So it's important to note first that very few women get elected to the Lebanese parliament, and those who do are usually related by blood or marriage to imported male politicians, the so-called Zoama. If they're not relatives of politicians, these women tend to be clients of the politicians. And when they are in power, they don't work to advance women's rights, but instead serve the interests of the sectarian leader and of the sect. And this is because of the sectarian system in place in Lebanon, more or less since the creation of the Lebanese state. So the first issue that I want to flag is religious personal status laws. Lebanon has 15 personal status laws that are religion-based, but has no civil code covering personal status issues such as divorce, inheritance, or custody of children. And religious courts preside over cases of personal status, resulting in the repeated violation of women's rights. Religious authorities have been keeping personal status laws under their control, even after the Taif Agreement, which had foreseen some form of desectarianization of the laws. The 15 different personal status laws differentiate between the rights, duties, and privileges of men and women. So every Lebanese citizen is funneled through the bureaucracy into one of 30 existing citizenships that are determined based on one's paternally inherited sect and the sex assigned at birth. For example, the rights and privileges of Maronite men vary drastically from those of Maronite women or the members of any other sect. So Lebanese American scholar Maya Mikdashi, who is at Rutgers University, has defined this form of citizenship as, quote, sectarianism, to reference how sex, sexuality, and sect structure legal bureaucratic systems, as well as how citizenship and statecraft are performed at the mutually constitutive intersections and suffusions between sex and sect. So what she calls this sectarian system operates to categorize the Lebanese population on the basis of their sect, sex, while promoting a heteronormative and endogamous understanding of Lebanese citizenship. Now, in the current crisis, it is very unlikely that any work will be done to change the personal status laws because it is seen as not a priority when people cannot feed themselves, when there is no electricity or water, etc. The other issue is nationality law. Lebanese women cannot pass their nationality to their children or foreign husbands, unlike Lebanese men. And so this deprives their children of citizenship and increases the risk of statelessness. And the Lebanese government has failed in its history to address this issue, citing the threat of naturalization and resettlement of Palestinian and Syrian refugees as a reason not to change this law for women. The fear is that the naturalization of Palestinians and Syrians will alter the demographic balance in Lebanon in favor of the Sunnis. And with the ongoing crisis in Lebanon, again, this issue is not likely to be addressed soon, and these women and their families will remain vulnerable. The third issue is domestic violence, and this is an issue that has been exacerbated in the past few years. This is an issue that affects all three categories of women. And the Lebanese parliament has indeed passed a domestic violence law in 2014, which includes protection measures, and has also given funding to enact the reforms. Also, the law has introduced some kind of official definition of domestic violence into the criminal code. However, Lebanese women are still at risk of marital rape, which because of pressure from religious authorities is not part of the criminal code. So a spousal threat or violence to claim marital right to intercourse is a crime, but the actual physical act is not. There's also a legal loophole which allows men to divorce their spouses after abusing them to escape prosecution in civil courts. And while marital rape affects Lebanese and refugee women, migrant women are at risk of rape and abuse by their employers because they have no legal protections due to the kafala system in place that Patricia alluded to. And after the financial crisis and the COVID pandemic, things have gotten worse for women. Like elsewhere in the world, the number of women hurt or killed by their husband has recently increased during the COVID pandemic, and also after the situation has become dire for most Lebanese families. In 2021, domestic violence doubled according to international security forces, the Lebanese internal security forces. And here I would like to flag the killing of women, which is part of domestic violence. It has increased by 107% in 2020 compared to 2019, according to the online feminist platform Sharika Walakin. And the press is rife with stories of women killed by their husbands or domestic partners. The deteriorating economic condition and the complete closure during the COVID pandemic are reasons behind the growth of the phenomenon. In addition, according to a survey by a local NGO conducted in 2021, 96% of domestic violence in Lebanon goes unreported by women and girls who have experienced it. Attention is often being diverted to the living aspects in the country, as was mentioned earlier: electricity, water, medicine shortage, food insecurity. Even women themselves, 3 out of 5 of the women in Lebanon consider economic challenges to be the most prominent challenge they currently face as women and girls, instead of the issue of domestic violence. And the fourth issue and final issue that I would like to flag, and Patricia also alluded to it, is the issue of child marriage. This issue affects Lebanese and refugee girls. Lebanon currently has no national minimum age of marriage. Instead, religious courts regulate when people can marry. And Human Rights Watch found that early marriage can lead to a higher risk of marital rape, exploitation, domestic violence, and health problems. As I said, those most at risk include Syrian and Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, in addition to Lebanese girls from poor and rural areas. Now, Lebanon has committed to eliminating child marriage by 2030. However, the many drafts of law raising the legal age of marriage to 18 have not passed through the Lebanese parliament because of sectarian backlash. And anecdotal evidence points to the increase in the number of child marriage in recent years, as parents cannot afford to send their girls to school or even to take care of them. And we can see this as a form of survival sex in the current situation. Now, there are some silver linings, I think. We have some really strong activism by organizations such as the NGOs Abad and Kaffa that fight against domestic violence and child marriage. There has been a very strong campaign for nationality law, the Jinsiyati campaign that fights for women's rights to nationality. I also think that the existence of female judges in Lebanon is an interesting silver lining. Since the beginning of the 1990s, the Lebanese judiciary has witnessed an increase in the proportion of female judges. And today, over half of the Lebanese judges in general are female. So this feminization of the judiciary might in the long run mean positive changes for women. While these female judges occupy minor or less important positions and they're unable to be judges in religious courts. However, when they are in civil courts, this is important for domestic violence issues. So what are the solutions? I think the most important solution is to end domestic violence and discrimination against women in Lebanon is the implementation of a unified personal status law devoid of any religious intervention. There is a need for unified and gender-sensitive personal status law that puts an end to legal, social, and economic discrimination against women, but this is unlikely to happen in the current situation. There's also a problem of accountability. Even when there are laws on the books, we have interference by sectarian leaders to protect members of their sect. And maybe the most notorious case is that of Rula Yaqub, whose husband killer was acquitted and cleared of all charges and left free for 9 years because of political influence before he was finally convicted by the Court of Cassation in March of 2022 and sentenced only to 5 years in prison for beating his wife to death in front of her minor children, minor daughters. And it's only because her mother and the NGO Kaffa kept fighting for justice that we could see this, verdict at the end. So I will end here.
Thank you, Rula. I do have some questions. I'll defer them till later. Zena, your turn.
Well, it's difficult to speak now. You know, the situation is like it's so terrible that I hear all these panels. And like, okay, what can we do then, and where do we start? The task is immense, and we, as the Swiss Foundation Accountability, now trying to do our little bit in a very practical way, which is finding impunity, fighting corruption, denouncing corruption, initiating legal proceedings outside of Lebanon to circumvent the muzzling of the judiciary. The World Bank, and I'm just going to quote the World Bank, says that the depression in Lebanon is deliberate and it serves the larger purpose of cementing political economy interests. So the World Bank doesn't even refer to public finance. It speaks of a Ponzi finance. And the UN Special Rapporteur issued a very thorough report last year, and he speaks of a man-made catastrophe with deep political roots. And he emphasizes that this crisis was avoidable. So to understand also the crisis for us, we had to look at how much of a source of profit it is for the political elite. Indeed, many people can't withdraw their money, but many people very well connected have about $9 billion. Those are the pessimistic numbers, but the optimistic ones are not much better. But $9 billion have left Lebanon in favor of politically connected people since 2019, when actually many households could not even access their petty savings to pay for hospital bills and for schools for their kids. So how is this possible? What role did the banking system play in enabling that corruption to happen? This is part of the things we're looking at. When I refer to the crisis being a source of profit, we We know, for example, that the banking system has been replaced with a cash economy. We spoke about it earlier, but there is a business around remittances, which are being sent from expats, from people outside of Lebanon to their families in Lebanon. And that is a business in itself, including for the banks. So the head of the banking association, for example, is heading one of these companies generating $400 million of profit a year. So I just wanted to start with that to say, actually, the crisis is not a crisis for everybody. It's still a very lucrative business for many. And then that takes me to how it all started somehow after the Civil War and why we see that level of impunity now. It's because well, we don't have real politicians here as we would see that in the Western world. It's the former militia and and the warlords, actually, who after the amnesty traded their guns for ties and self-declared themselves politicians, and they then wrapped the state around their interest, and they turned Lebanon into a host they could feed upon. We see that in all our investigations. Nabil mentioned that earlier. So each institution, each structure, each project is a power shared venture between the political parties who installed loyalists at each prominent position. So, for example, the Central Fund for the Displaced, the Council of the South, the Council for Development and Reconstruction, the cement industry, the oil sector, power generation, garbage collection, Nabil mentioned it, but also the reconstruction of the downtown of Beirut through Solidaire after the war, but also the Beirut port, which, was the Beirut port explosion was just a tragic reminder of. So there is a complex set of factors that have been orchestrated and created actually by the political elite to ensure this impunity in pillaging the state resources. So they made sure, and here I'm like referring to the analysis of the United Nations Development Agency, but we see it, in a very practical way on the ground. So they ensured that the institutional arrangements for control and audits remain outdated and ineffective. So there is no control, no audit. The police and the judicial capacities are extremely limited. The key laws to combat corruption are totally absent, and the public administration is absolutely inefficient. And adding to that, 30% of the population of the active population is employed by the state. So the political elite offered jobs somehow in exchange of loyalty. And then also they build dependencies of their constituents by providing them all the basic services, which the state, actually they made sure that the state will never be in a position to provide these services such as healthcare, education, water, or even electricity. So that is the theory of it, but us as human rights lawyers and activists on the ground, we see how it translates into the real muzzling somehow of the judiciary in Lebanon. And at our level, we're just trying to circumvent that by initiating proceedings outside of Lebanon. I can speak more details about each of these items, about the Beirut port explosion, about why the investigations are stalled, for the same reasons, actually, because loyalist judges have been installed at prominent position. We see it at all levels of the judiciary, from the prosecutor, the state prosecutor, to minor judges and minor positions. The system is totally locked, and yet we see courageous judges here and there trying to be independent, to voice the voice of the change. And I'm happy to answer more detailed questions about our fight against corruption, the outcome of our investigations. And I would link that to the latest news yesterday that you might have heard, that once very powerful central bank governor is now also under investigation in Lebanon, with European judges visiting Lebanon to interrogate him and his network and his entourage for the second time. It's a big victory for us. He is certainly not the only one. He's certainly not the most corrupt, but we had to start somewhere, and that it's a positive note somehow to end my talk here, to say yes, change can happen, and although it's difficult, we cannot just watch helplessly, and we try to do our fair share.
Yeah, Zena, thanks very much. Since you were last to talk, and since you left so much time you did the news, I am going to ask you about what's happening with Mr. Salami, and where do you see this investigation going? We're not talking only about the European aspect of the investigation, the European leg of the investigation, but also in Lebanon itself. What's happening? We know that there's a problem with the judiciary, but Mr. Salami has had many people defending him, has many friends. Where are these going?
So there are now several investigations open in Europe, with prosecutors and investigative magistrates being in charge of the files. So it's not only like one jurisdiction in Europe. We're talking about aggravated money laundering. And then this aggravated money laundering means that there is conspiracy. There is a larger network of corruption. The term aggravated, which is being used by European prosecutors, means that there is a professional network of money launderer. So they had anticipated the fact that Mr. Salami had not acted alone, but now we see what it means, like in practical terms, and that would remain very factual, because they're obviously all still innocent, despite the dire situation of the country, but innocent until proven guilty. But for example, we see now that the investigation is extending to the Prime Minister Miati for a transfer of $14 million that has been made in favor of Mr. Salami when he was in office on a Swiss bank account. So the investigations are expanding, and what is the relevance to Lebanon is that it's now becoming in the interest of many people to shut down the investigations as soon as possible, because they are realizing that it's no longer a Mr. Salami, Riyad, Raja, kids and cousins who are involved, but soon they would be at risk themselves as well. There are evidence of transfers made by also several other politicians involved in other companies. So it is a system, I think we all pointed at that to say nobody acted single-handedly, or nobody is sole responsible. Nobody is can bear the responsibility of everything that is happening. It is a system, and it held together because of that. So the investigations are moving forward. They are expanding. The risk is obviously that it is now totally shut down, because under the guise of wanting justice in Lebanon, under the guise of the Lebanese state, which we anticipate will want to become civil party and claim the restitution of the funds to Lebanon. We have been anticipating this move for the last 6 months. It's happening starting to happen in the last days. Well, it is still a pretext. It's still, part of the game to, pretend that they are seeking justice, but the level of impunity is such that even though the investigations continue, we believe that they would be very narrowed down and very quickly.
There is an excellent question by one of our audience members, Hisham Musa, who says, this is an excellent review of the situation in Lebanon. The question is, what do we do? Is there no hope? I am going to start by asking Nabil. You said, well, short of getting rid of the whole system, nothing is going to work. But getting rid of the whole system is a big shebang. It's going to take a long time, and it's almost impossible to happen. Most likely, things will happen step by step. What do you think should be started with? What is the first step to do something about, something positive about the Lebanese situation?
Well, I published, I think, with you a year ago, the idea of an international development fund for Lebanon. I think theoretically, at least, this is a practical idea. It could be a practical idea. if the motivation was there in the international community to do it. Essentially, it has been done in the past, but it requires the big powers and other leading powers to agree to set up a fund for reconstructing all the Lebanese infrastructure, all the basic services. This fund would be managed outside of Lebanon, experts, financial experts, etc., so that money is not handled by any of the Lebanese elites, and so that the contracts are doled out also by international experts. This is the only way to take the reconstruction game out of the mafia leaders' hands in Lebanon. It was done in Iraq a couple of times. And if the Lebanese ask for it, I mean, it's not going to happen. Nobody, the US or Europe is going to say, hey, let's do this. The Lebanese have to ask for it. And Lebanese civil society could come up with this idea. I mean, Lebanese civil society has been very active. There is an opposition. Problem is they don't have one master plan and they don't agree on any particular candidate for parliament or presidency. But if they agree on a plan like this, they can lobby the international community to bring it about, to make it happen. I mentioned that, you know, the dollar figure I flagged, the discrepancy in international aid between Ukraine and Lebanon, to highlight that the international community has lost interest, despite what the State Department occasionally says. The US ambassador to Lebanon, we love Lebanon, we want to help, etc. But really, Lebanon has lost the value that it once had for the US and for Europe. It is no longer the banking sector of the Middle East. Dubai took that position a long time ago, plus the banking sector has totally collapsed, so why need Lebanon for that? It used to be the information center of the Middle East. It is no longer that. On and on. I mean, the US is pivoting away gradually from the Middle East. So the motivation isn't there, but this is something the Lebanese can ask for, can work for. The money is there nationally and internationally. The expertise is there. You just have to have a mechanism outside of the Lebanese structure to manage this fund and make the development happen.
Okay, thank you, Nabil. It's working. Okay, good. Patricia, I have a question for you. We're talking about conditionality here. The IMF conditionality, they are reluctant to give any money, like Nabil has mentioned, that keep it away from the Lebanese politicians, which is to me, it's the excellent solution. But you know, the IMF has had conditions on the Lebanese government. Okay, we need you to institute some reforms that are very, very important before we give you any money to try to get out of these crises. This conditionality, how long can, is it a push-pull kind of situation? I mean, how long can the Lebanese wait until the IMF relents, or how long can the IMF wait with its conditions on Lebanon, considering the situation, the worsening situation?
I mean, it's a chicken and egg situation. I mean, it's a difficult question to answer because I don't have a sense that the IMF is going to relent. And to be honest, it should not relent. But I do, I mean, so I don't see this standoff sort of resolving itself anytime soon. But there is one big factor, and that helps me respond to the former question as well, which is, I mean, currently the situation is in paralysis. So big picture response is also, I mean, there needs to be the election of a president. And so to begin with, I mean, you know, without the president, there's no government. Without president and government, there's no response to, there's no attempt to respond to the IMF. There's no ability to issue binding policies or develop them or pass any economic recovery plan. So I did want to say one thing, and though there are internal divisions and a confluence of external factors which are not necessarily helping the process further, one factor which could push there in potentially in a positive direction, though maybe it's a long shot, is the current Saudi-Iranian reconciliation. And I don't know if others want to comment on that, but it could change things, as I think the Saudi Arabia is sort of opting for more diplomacy instead of confrontation, and is sort of walking back some of the hawkish foreign policy. At the same time, you know, it hasn't quite, its relations with Lebanon are more or less, or have been frosty. And the reaction has been from the Saudi foreign minister that Lebanon needs more Lebanese rapprochement than Iranian Saudi rapprochement, or something to that effect. You know, suggesting that it's separating kind of the concerns, you know, from the regional, but it may allow, I think, some movement on the local front. I also wanted to just say one brief thing, since I did cover the humanitarian dimension, in looking for maybe some ways to some positive things that could happen, because all the panelists have talked about the challenges, you know, of course, that have to do with political patronage and corruption, and how fraught, you know, the government is with all of that, and the deep distrust that there is, if you will, towards the Lebanese state. And that, I think, distrust sort of extends to refugees and international actors as well. And so I think one area where some more work can be done is aid delivery. And I think aid delivery has largely bypassed the state. Okay, and some people have talked about, you know, the potential for it weakening capacity or serving as a substitute for the state. But I do think that, you know, one way that sort of more can be done is supporting sort of the actors that have tried to fill the gap, including the civil society and the municipalities, which have really played an important role in trying to mitigate some of these crises by delivering food, clothing, medicine, cash, etc. We saw it most prominently in the aftermath of the Beirut blast. And so I think you know, given that local government and NGOs tend to be more closer to sort of the needs of the marginalized communities, they can be kind of partners in addressing some of this social and geographic imbalances that are exacerbated in the current context. At the same time, that's not to say that these NGOs don't suffer from some of the same problems, but that's not a reason for not trying to kind of help build capacity, help improve coordination, information sharing, and making sure that they don't you know, they don't get affected by the same problems that are broadly plaguing society.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks, Patricia. Rola, I have a question. You've identified really some very, very important areas, personal status laws, nationality law, the domestic violence legislation, and child marriage issue. I'm thinking I want to throw at you a question that has to do with Parliament. The forces of change that were elected. I think there are 12 members of Parliament who are considered, you know, agents of change in the body today. I mean, where are they on these issues? I mean, is there any possibility for them to influence these issues in Parliament?
I mean, there's such a small number that, I mean, the Parliament is 128. So 12 members, that's barely 10%. They have to create alliances with the big electoral groups, electoral blocks in Parliament that are controlled by sectarian leaders. So even if they have the will, and I know that some of the MPs like Halim Al-Qakoor has the will to make some of these changes or to push for some of these changes, I don't think they can do much in the current situation because they need more bodies, more people in those seats to vote with them. So I don't see anything changing in the near future.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that, but I guess this is also a part of the change agenda, the reform agenda for the whole country. I mean, it comes with other things as well. I have a question here. I'll throw it at you. We'll see who can take it. Which country is most vested in Lebanon today? This is a question from Andrew Massines. Which country is most vested in Lebanon today?
I'm happy to take that. I think it's Iran. I think Iran has been spending a lot of money and capital on its relationship with Lebanon in the past few decades. And it's definitely invested in Hezbollah, which is today a state within the state. So yeah, the short answer is Iran. Maybe we're starting to see Syria come back. But yeah, the combo Iran and Syria, I would say.
Let me add. Yeah, let me add to that. I think in terms of, depends on how you mean vested or invested, whether materially or politically. I think the problem with the two big ones in the region, Saudi Arabia and Iran, which supposedly now have a new agreement and the brave new world is about to open up in the region because of that. But the problem is, and they're both invested, but they both help the sides that they think are closest to them. And they are, along with their material investment, they are politically invested. I think Qatar, which is politically neutral as far as the fighting and the competition inside Lebanon is concerned, is capable of helping both to mediate political conflicts and to invest in reconstruction without it being considered to be helping one side or the other. And that's one option that has not been explored in Lebanon, possibly because the two big blocs inside can't agree on using the help of Qatar. And by using the help of Qatar, I mean being able to put it all in Qatar's lap and say, you know, here's the problem. Now, you know, you have the whole thing, help us with it. I think another potential, which is a bit distant at the moment, is China. China has come into Middle East diplomacy in a big way by midwifing this agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Clearly, they've been preparing for the past 20 years to enter the world of politics and diplomacy in a big way. And I think they feel ready now to do so. They're starting with the big picture, which is the big bloc competition in the region. But I think they might be interested in getting down to some of the other sub-regional problems. I think it's a little more far-fetched at the moment, and I would personally favor the Qatari approach as more practical. But I think China has to be considered as a big power with lots of resources, with a big ability to get in there and construct and reconstruct without it owing allegiance to any of the local factions.
Yeah, I agree with your assessment and with your assessment, Rola, except that, Nabil, I don't know, China doesn't come in free. China comes in and makes leases, 99-year leases on whatever that it helps to reconstruct in the country, which is fine as far as I'm concerned. Lebanon can need a lot of reconstruction but interesting that neither of you has mentioned and probably correctly, neither the United States nor France that could be vested in Lebanon. Patricia, you want to say something on this?
I want to address, if you've exhausted it, I want to go back to the change and peace too, and the possibility of change.
Oh, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I do think that, in the spirit of being constructive and maybe seeing some rays of light, I do, and I saw some of the comments in the chat had to do with some of the disaffection with the change movement. I do think that one has to manage one's expectations in their regard. And I think it is true that people have been disappointed with the fact that they couldn't get their act together in any concrete way. But at the same time, I do think there's still room to do some of that. But I do think that we need to view this as a bridgehead into the future. And the way they should be thinking about it is as follows, and not, and try to kind of be aware of their limitations, but also try to find synergies and low-hanging fruits that will get them to the next election. And the other component is change MPs, yes, but there are a lot of independents in parliament that they can ally with. So there's the potential of work to be done at a broader level than just 12, or it's no longer 13, it's 12 now, I guess, MPs that could kind of, if managed in a way that is strategic, could potentially serve as a bridgehead to the future. And that's, I'm just saying that I'm not putting all my hopes there, but I'm saying there is a possibility there, given what they stood for, and that they did represent kind of the voice of people who were fed up with the whole system and what was going on.
Yes, thank you. Nabil, our friend Joseph Shbaili has almost a detailed explanation for you that really, the international community has been really committed to Lebanon, and they have helped. Problem is the Lebanon itself is not instituting the reforms that are needed, and he does have a point. Zaina, you want to add something here? Okay, it's all right.
Yes, I could. Sorry, can you hear me? I could add something with respect to the reforms, because we filed a request for sanctions at the level of the Council of the European Union against those individuals who obstruct the implementation of these reforms. And these reforms are so important because any international aid is contingent upon the implementation of these reforms. And who's blocking these reforms is the Lebanese elite. They have repeatedly and systematically sabotaged the negotiations with the international community under the undue influence by the banking sector. So in a very detailed submission, we explain who is benefiting from this obstruction, why reforms are dangerous for the political elite. We're talking about reforms. What does reform mean? A reform means a reform of the judiciary. A reform of the judiciary means independent judges. Independent judges are a threat for the system. All boards, across the spectrum, it's an apolitical, non-sectarian statement in the sense that this corruption extends across the political spectrum. So everybody is obstructing the implementation of reforms to secure their own impunity. And so there is still a possibility, if for international actors somehow to impose individual targeted sanctions against those who are privileging their private interests to the detriment of the population who's in dire need of this international aid.
Thank you. I'm going to ask this question to Rullah from Amal Watfa Karaki. Do you agree that there are subgroups of women within the categories of women you mentioned? There is young versus elderly whose needs differ, and therefore the interventions to address these needs should take this into consideration?
Yes, of course, we should adopt an intersectional approach. When we look at women, we can't think of them as one big category. We need to look at class and level of education and socioeconomic status, and also probably age when we address some of the issues facing women in Lebanon. However, I think the issues that I flagged, especially the personal status laws, affect all women across the board. And whether you're old or young, the problem is the same. You have to go through the courts when you marry, when you divorce, if you want custody of your children, etc. So yes, the needs differ, but I think some problems are common to all.
Right. Catherine Habib asks, could the panel describe the role and interests of Israel in the current situation? Anybody want to take that, Nabil?
Yes, I deliberately mentioned in my presentation the successive Israeli bombardments, specifically of the electricity grid, but also of other infrastructure issues in Lebanon. I think this relates to US policy. And I maintain that the motivation in the US has dropped. Perhaps mixing the US with the international community is not appropriate because each component of that community is different. But the motivation on the part of the US has dropped. And in the US, you can tell motivation by going to the budget. Where there is a motivation, there is a big budget, Ukraine. Where there is no motivation, there's a small humanitarian assistance and a lot of good talk and sort of advertising good wishes and so on, but no real action. The problem in the US is that the focus, at least for the past 10 years, has been on Hezbollah. A lot of the LAF, for example, the budget for the LAF is justified inside the State Department and on the Hill as we're helping the institution that's going to replace Hezbollah, that's going to stand up to Hezbollah. So the assistance there is politically motivated, is slanted from the point of view of US security as perceived, and it's not fashioned after the general interest of Lebanon. It's not fashioned after, here's the big problem in Lebanon, and here's what we can do to fix Lebanon, and here's the budget for it. It's not done like that. So it's piecemeal, and it's focused on Hezbollah. And who is focused on Hezbollah more than the US administration? It's Israel. And Israel drives the agenda here. I think in the end of the day, Israel hasn't just destroyed Lebanon several times in the past 2 decades, but it has also poisoned the politics inside Lebanon and internationally. So yes, there is a big part of the blame that falls on Israel. But in the end of the day, when all is said and done, and all the big bad guys all over the world have done their bit, the responsibility ultimately is on the Lebanese people. They alone have the power to fix this situation if they genuinely want to.
Thank you. This question from William Grant, I hope he's not calling for restoration. Did these problems exist when Syria controlled Lebanon? What would it take to force the Lebanese political elite to give up control? Patricia?
That's the $1 million question, Ahmad.
Yes.
I mean, I can't but echo what Nabil has said. I mean, how do you, or maybe you said it in the beginning, how do you, it's the power interest situation. I mean, how do you have power, your power is linked to your own personal interest. How do you change that? I mean, how do you convince people who are benefiting from being in power to give up all of this when this would also open them up to legal liability and all sorts of criminal liability. There's no incentive, to be honest. And without any significant external push in that direction, it seems very unlikely that any of that will happen. And I think that's why one has to focus on, you know, small scale, maybe changes or pressure from below. And it might be quite idealistic of me, you know, when I say that. One thing that I thought about during this panel, because somebody brought it up in the chat, but it was a little bit outside the realm of the discussion, this idea of renewables. And I mean, I've been thinking a lot about climate change. And, you know, I can't remember exactly what the question is, but I do think that with the rising price of fuel and the removal of subsidies, you know, you have surging fuel prices, which I mean, and again, this is a small problem, not the political elite question. I'm saying some kind of maybe possible movement in a positive direction to kind of break the hold of the generator mafia. Is this, I think people are beginning to think seriously about solar energy as an alternative. The problem is that there isn't regulation around it, and therefore there's a lot of price fluctuation around, you know, solar options, and you don't have that many specialists working on the issue, so you get a lot of tech issues and problems with low quality issues, safety hazard issues, etc. But there is kind of a movement and a possibility, because Lebanon has quite a bit of land that can be populated with large solar and wind farms, and has like 300 days of daylight, let's say. It doesn't require sunlight. So investing in that area, which is, you know, as of now, not as politicized, could be kind of a way of moving things a little bit more positively for people and relieving some of the burden that they're facing now. The other thing that I also thought about was one silver lining maybe of the impact of the economic collapse, maybe this creation of this new space for for local production. And Lebanon has been very dependent on imports, right, which make up like some 80% of goods and commodities like in the market. But the devaluation has really made them prohibitively expensive. And therefore, what we're seeing is local production increasing in some sectors, because still you rely, I mean, there's a reliance on imports even for local production, but like agriculture, I don't know, olive oil, small industries, some services, which, you know, are facing challenges, I think, like with the expected power cuts and the fuel and some reliance on imports. But this is something international and national actors can maybe build on a trend to support more local production in some sectors like the agriculture, because there's vast land that can be used and is underutilized. So investing in things like that will create jobs, but also in the case of food and agriculture, will reduce some vulnerabilities and humanitarian needs like food insecurity. So I just stop talking.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I wanted to ask that question, but I wanted to keep it until later, so until the end, so to speak. But yeah, this question and related others were sent by Christian Porth, and but Christian also has an interesting question. He's talking about Saraya al-Muqawama. Saraya al-Muqawama, for the general audience, these are brigades that are friendly to Hezbollah, from not necessarily Hezbollah soldiers, but they are partisans, so to speak, that you know, like Hezbollah, and the Saraya al-Muqawama were established by Hezbollah. So he's talking about, is there any chance of ending the Saraya al-Muqawama in Lebanon? Rula? Should I put you on the spot here?
Sure. Well, the Saraya al-Muqawama, first of all, are about 90% Shia, I would argue. And so members of the other communities that are part of the Saraya al-Muqawama are not a great number. And I think as long as Hezbollah is in charge of the country, we're not going to see an end to Saraya al-Muqawama, because it is providing some kind of intersectarian or even Christian cover for Hezbollah, the same way the understanding with the Free Patriotic Movement does. I mean, the Free Patriotic Movement has provided a Christian cover for Hezbollah in the past 10, 15 years. So yeah, I don't see an end to Saraya al-Muqawama anytime soon. And in the first place, I don't think they're super effective. I think they're more PR than anything else. Most of the fighting is usually done by Hezbollah members themselves rather than Saraya al-Muqawama.
Zaina, I'd like to ask you about what, in your estimation, I know you want it to happen tomorrow, but in your estimation, how long will it take for the Lebanese judiciary, the judicial branch of government, to be what it is supposed to be, which is impartial, apolitical, independent?
Well, that depends very much on the people of Lebanon, right? I believe that every Lebanese citizen or voter in Lebanon has a responsibility. There is no help coming from outside or like a miracle situation that the judiciary will change or the political system will change. All that is just a reflection of what the population is at somehow. And then there is that it very much depends on the population. So maybe it's a change of generation somehow for the old warlords, mafia, militias to die. Somehow, they're getting older. And then maybe, so this is the real hope, is like for the new generation, those who are now at university, who still believe that the change is possible, to come and become the new generation, who will allow this change to happen. So I don't have a time estimate, but just a hypothesis, but that's the cycle of life. Somehow it's not, it doesn't pertain to Lebanon, the old generation goes and then a new fresh blood comes with different ideas.
Well, thank you very much for that. Yeah, I just hope it doesn't take the 50 years that Nabil started with today. We're out of time. I want to thank the panelists. Appreciate your taking time out from your busy schedules to join us today. This was really a very, very nice webinar, and I hope to see you again, and we appreciate your efforts. Thank you also for the audience for joining us today. We appreciate it, and we hope that you stay connected with the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Check out our webinars, our papers, our publications, and join our upcoming seminars and conferences in the future. Thank you very much, and have a very, very nice day.